Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the special joint meeting of the DeKalb City Council and our Finance Advisory Committee, November 20th, 2018. Prior to the start of this evening's meeting, I'd like to remind anyone in the audience who would like to speak, either for an item not on the agenda or to an item on our agenda tonight. We only have the two items. One is the proposed FY 2019 budget. The other is the 2018 property tax levy discussion. But if you would like to speak, we would ask you to kindly fill out a speaker request form. They're in the back of the room as you came in. Please kindly give those request forms. I have two already this evening to our city clerk, Lynn Fazekas. She'll get those to me, and we'll get those on at the appropriate time. I now ask Lynn to please call the roll.
Jacobson. Finucane.
Here.
Marquardt. Fagan.
Here.
Noriko.
Here.
Verbig.
Here.
Favor.
Here.
Smith.
Here.
Higgerson.
Here.
Neely. Here. Parker.
Here.
Parch.
Here.
Tarazinski.
Here.
Peddle.
Here.
12 present.
Thank you, Lynn. Prior to public participation tonight, allow me to make a few comments regarding where I think we want to go tonight. We will make no firm decisions based on any voting tonight necessarily. However, I would hope that we would be able to reach some consensus between the Finance Advisory Committee and the City Council on these two major budget items. Also, I would like to then suggest that Ray Munch, who is our interim assistant city manager, he's going to be here. We'll make a few brief remarks. As you know, those of you who got the background material, we have quite a bit of voluminous background material. I've asked Ray to pull out some of what I thought the more cogent, meaningful graphs, and he'll put those up on the screen. So having said that, again, I would like to move to the public participation portion of tonight's meeting. I would ask the speakers to kindly try to remain within that 3-minute limit. And our first participant tonight is Mark Charvat. Mark?
It was good to see you, Dave. All right. I want to address a couple things since this is a portion of the agenda where I can address some items that are not on the agenda. The city released a press release last week when all the information came down regarding the alleged $250,000 misappropriation. A statement was issued on the official City of DeKalb website, and the statement identified a public relations firm that was hired by the City of DeKalb that deals in crisis public relations. I would like to find out, first off, why this particular PR firm was hired. Upon contacting the PR firm, I tried to get some answers because the initial statement indicated for individuals who have questions to contact the PR firm. The PR firm told me they could not answer any questions, hence to call the city. So as a citizen, I kind of felt like a human ping pong ball trying to get some answers. So I have a problem with that. The second problem, which I've identified with our acting city manager, was in reference to why the statement was pulled 24 hours later. And I believe it's important for perhaps, Ray, you to let the public know why you amended that statement and why the original statement is no longer on the website. I feel that I do believe it is against the law to publish something and then suddenly redact it and make it disappear. Once it's part of the public record, I believe it needs to remain a part of the public record. So there is a PR firm the city hired. I'm kind of curious why they won't answer questions and city personnel won't answer questions in relation to this $250,000 appropriation. I wanted questions answered based on the misappropriation, not so much pointing fingers at individuals, but I have some other questions which I'll address to that misappropriation during the actual budget item, which I've signed up to speak on. Now, one thing that the city did in closed session and they voted in public session was to relieve the current city manager of her duties and return her to the finance director position. The problem is this person is on administrative leave. This person has apparently been accused of something, and hence, while an investigation is conducted, the city acted to put this individual on administration leave. Since this individual has been put on administration leave, two other individuals sitting in this room, including our mayor and our city attorney, have also been identified in a public filing in reference to another issue. I'm kind of curious as to why the same sort of administration leave has not been placed upon those individuals, our city attorney and our mayor. We did it to the city manager, but not to the other two identified. Public needs to have trust in this council, and I believe until an investigation is completed, that would be the appropriate thing to do, to relieve our city attorney and our mayor in the interim until this investigation is concluded. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Are there any other folks in the audience who would like to speak to any items under public participation not dealing with our items on the agenda tonight? If not, let's move on to item number C on the agenda, and that's the review of the proposed FY 2019 budget. And I'd like to ask our interim city manager, Ray Munch, to speak to this item. Ray?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If I could call your attention back to what was scheduled to be the original joint FAC City Council meeting on November 5th. Prior to that meeting being called, an agenda item was prepared. And during the course of that preparation for the agenda item, certain city staff realized that there were items within that agenda item that needed to be addressed in greater depth. So regrettably, that forced us to cancel the joint FAC City Council meeting and undergo an in-depth look into some of the things that were included in that agenda item for the November 5th meeting. So what I would like to do tonight is walk through with you very briefly what was learned as part of that inquiry and where that leaves us today in terms of both the FY18 and FY19 budget. So I'm going to walk through council and FAC what we learned about the use of IPBC funds over the course of the past several weeks. I want to be very clear that the conversation I'm going to have this evening is specific to what we learned in regards to numbers and budgetary items within the city and not who did what at what time. So, as most of you are aware, the city purchases its health insurance through a government cooperative called IPBC, the Intergovernmental Public Benefit Cooperative. This is a cooperative of municipalities and other public entities that have come together to buy health insurance as a group to presumably receive better rates on their health insurance. It's a risk pool, essentially. Through IPBC, insurance premiums are determined on an annual basis for the city and their employees. This is based on historic claim levels and a recommendation from IPBC as to where they see health insurance costs going in the future year. IPBC rates are applied on a fiscal year that starts July 1, so it's off from the city's fiscal year. So that rate change comes about mid-year for the city. So there's a little bit of a balancing act that we deal with when we set our premiums on an annual basis. When the city pays its insurance costs, the insurance costs are broken down and pulled from multiple sources. So for example, the employees pay 20% of the health insurance premium. The employer pays 80% of the health insurance premium. In addition, the Cal Public Library and their employees are included in the city's health insurance plan. Their contributions are allocated differently than the 80-20 split that the city utilizes for our employees, but they pay into that system nonetheless. It also includes contributions from our retirees that are still on our health insurance plan. And it also includes contributions from COBRA recipients that were former employees. All those contributions into our health insurance pool are aggregated into a local health insurance fund that the city maintains in its budgeted accounts. Through IPBC, a monthly ACH withdrawal is taken from the city account up to the IPBC account, where those funds remain for the payment of the monthly premiums that are handled through IPBC, as well as claims. Money is held at IPBC in 4 separate accounts. Those are an HMO account, a benefit account, an admin account, and a terminal reserve account. Only one of those accounts shows up on the city's comprehensive annual financial report. That's the terminal reserve account. The other 3 accounts do not appear in our CAFR or any of our budget documents that are prepared on an annual basis. So I want to take you back to September 25th of 2017. This is when the initial health insurance premium for City of DeKalb and City of DeKalb employees was put together in a spreadsheet. Just as an example, I'll call your attention to the top line where we look at the HMO single premium. It shows the full annual premium is $7,077 and some change. That is the full premium for the HMO single coverage. You'll see that the employee, their 20% portion is $1,415, and then it shows the city contribution of $5,661. That was prepared and submitted as what would be the annual premium for the 2018 calendar year for the employees. You can see it blown up in greater detail there, how that breaks down over the 26 pay periods that are utilized in the city to pay employees, and it shows how that breakdown comes to our what is supposed to be 80-20 split for health insurance premiums between employer and employee. The September 2017 costs were based on the full annual cost, including the July 1st premium increase that we received from IPBC. Shortly after the cost was prepared, a discussion was initiated regarding the potential use of IPBC fund balances to cover a portion of health insurance costs for the following year. A revised cost was prepared in October of 2017. The revision was based on the city's cost of insurance on the initial 6-month period, which is a lower portion of the rate, carrying forward through the entire year. That revision was based on the employees' cost of insurance, including retirees and those paying into COBRA and others, and was figured on the combined rate, which included the July 1st rate increase. So essentially, the city's cost held constant from the initial lower rate of the 6 months, but the employee rate elevated at July 1st when the rate increased. So a secondary spreadsheet is prepared here where you can see that the employee portion of the health insurance premium, that 20%, remained constant, but the total annual cost was lowered from what was $7,077 to $6,904. So that's where that change occurred in the annual premium. But what you can see is, even though the annual premium amount is lowered, the employee portion of that stays consistent. And I should point out that while we're using the HMO as an example in this numbers carry through the same no matter what type of health insurance you're talking about, PPO, HMO. So again, this is a detail of the numbers as reflected in October of 17. And if you look in the bottom table, the green table, what you'll see is when those numbers were changed, what it did is it threw the 80-20 split out of whack. It actually puts it at 20.5 for the employee and 79.5 for the employer. And you can see again, when you break that down for the employee cost, comparing one versus the other, the impact there. So again, the employee cost stayed the same in that fourth column. And when you make that change, it increases it to 20.5% because essentially the employer portion is reduced slightly.
Ray, that's off the 6,900
Correct. So
rather than the 77. So you're saying of the reduced amount, 20.5% was being covered by the employer.
that's correct. Thank you. What we also learned is that when you factor in some other benefits that were included in the employer portion, which were some wellness benefits and life insurance benefits that were not truly health insurance premiums, when you back those costs out, it actually put the employer at an actual percentage contribution of 77.5%. And again, this just talks about the fact that there was an inclusion of some other benefits in that employer portion that should have been backed out when we talked about just the premium. This is a little bit difficult to read on this screen, but this is essentially the spreadsheet that city staff utilizes to determine all the employee contributions and salary schedules when we put the budget together. The HMO single, again, that we're using as an example, holds constant throughout this and shows a consistent withdrawal from employee paychecks based on that higher annual premium rate, even though the city portion is lowered to $69.04. Similarly, this is the actual form that is provided to City of DeKalb employees that shows their insurance premiums for the upcoming year. Again, difficult to read on this size screen, but what I'll point out is that the annual premium noted on the sheet that was provided to employees reflected the higher number, the $7,077. So the lowered premium amount for the employer was not reflected in the information provided to employees. Again, here's a larger screenshot removed from that page that I just showed on the prior slide. Should note that the same premium information was also provided to COBRA recipients and retirees that are responsible for paying all or some of their health insurance premiums. So again, essentially there was a reduced overall cost used to calculate the city's share of health insurance. The higher overall cost was used to calculate the employee share, and the lower cost was used to calculate the employer's share. Again, of the 4 IPBC accounts, there's an admin, a benefit, and HMO account. Only those can be used for expenses within that account. For example, the admin fund is used for administrative expenses. The benefit fund is used to pay claims and things of that nature. Money from those accounts can be transferred to the terminal reserve. And once money is in that terminal reserve, it can be used for a wider variety of purposes, buying down premiums or transferring back to a municipality. We looked through past city records, and really there was some discussion in records going back to 2016 with the FAC that there could be use of terminal reserve, but it was in small amounts. What we found was a discussion of $13,000 at one point in 2016. But there's absolutely no record of any discussion on the use of terminal reserves with the City Council or the FAC in terms of what I've just laid out for you in the previous slides. There was no discussion in the FY18 budget preparation or any meetings with the City Council or the FAC. So in January in 2019, once we entered the new budget year, city staff initiated a transfer request from IPBC to transfer $150,000 from the benefit fund.
That's 18.
No, this happened in 2019.
It can't.
It can't.
January
We're not there yet.
Sorry, 2018. You're right.
January
You're right.
2018, okay.
That's there on the slide. My apologies. So in January 2018, we brought $150,000 from the benefit fund to the terminal reserve. That $150,000 plus $100,000 that was already sitting in the terminal reserve were used to reduce the February 2018 IPBC payment from the city by $250,000. That transfer was not discussed with the City Council. It was not brought for discussion at any point. The only way you would have known that this would have happened is if you looked at the warrant list that's included in a City Council agenda for February. It showed a reduced payment to IPBC for that month, and that reduction was $250,000. The transfer and the reduction in the premiums are, again, not directly identified in the FY18 budget. So, taking you back to this issue being uncovered, prior to realizing that this $250,000 transfer was made, you would have realized that the health insurance fund, that local health insurance fund, is roughly $200,000 under budget, and that's projected out through the end of 2018. This is likely reflected because of that 1 month reduction in the IPBC payment. But again, throughout the course of 2018, employees, retirees, library employees, COBRA recipients are still paying that full 20% premium from the full premium rate that we started with. 100% of the savings that were realized through this use of the IPBC funds were a benefit to the city. Again, it's important to note that the money that sits in IPBC is funds that are taken up to IPBC after the employer and the employee make their contributions. So the monies that sit there are funds that have been, over time, 10 years or more, contributions of employer and employee and retirees. So again, there's really no discussion as to the allocation of the benefit in terms of who has paid into this fund over time. That's not broken out in any way. So we can't look at those funds and say the employer has X number of dollars in the terminal reserve and the employees have, X number of dollars. It's not broken down that way at IPBC. So corrective action was taken once this came to light. The City Council moved swiftly to authorize the supplemental payment, which occurred at our last City Council meeting. And the resulting outcome is that employees, retirees, COBRA recipients have now paid an appropriate share. The balance has been brought back so that the employer paid 80% and the employee paid 20% over the course of 2018. We have gone ahead and made sure that all of the spreadsheets that were used to put together the FY19 budget have the proper allocations using the proper numbers. So it's represented in this spreadsheet here. That's where we get into the 2019 budget process. So we have been working off of a 5-year financial forecast, and unbeknownst to some people, there was an indication in that forecast all along that a little over $273,000 was going to be transferred from our local health insurance fund to the general fund as a budget balancing measure. That was, to my knowledge, never discussed expressly, but it was contained within a line of the spreadsheet of the 5-year financial forecast that we've been working off of for most of the year. This represented the full end of year, fiscal year 18, projected fund balance for this local health insurance fund. So it would have eliminated any reserves that remained in the local health insurance fund. And that would have included the $250,000 reduced payment to IPBC that had occurred earlier in the year. So the health insurance fund is a deposit account for employee and employer dollars that are paid through payroll, and they sit in that fund before they're ACH withdrawn up to IPBC. This fund also handles any of our life insurance and wellness benefits that are paid for employees. Again, within that fund, there's no accounting for what's employer and employee dollars in that fund. It's just a general pool of money by which the premiums are pulled up to IPBC. Again, also includes all of our retiree contributions and any library contributions that are made. Those are also held there. Here's a screenshot of the 5-year financial forecast where you would have seen, had you noticed, the intended transfer of the $273,000. That ultimately came to light, as I said, prior to the November 5th joint meeting that was previously scheduled, when there was a realization that in the 5-year financial forecast, there was an error in one cell of a spreadsheet that incorrectly projected the hotel motel tax revenue for 2019 to increase at a rate of 102% instead of 2%. That was merely an extra one in a cell of a spreadsheet. It was, as best we can tell, nothing more than that. It was a spreadsheet error. However, you might be able to see that took the FY18 estimate for hotel motel tax revenue from $282,000 all the way to $619,000 for FY19, and that's a highly unrealistic projection. So in order to rectify that spreadsheet error, the 5-year forecast was revised on November 1st to increase the transfer from the health insurance fund from $273,000 to $450,000 with an intended use of the IPBC funds back to general fund. That was a $177,000 increase from what was originally projected in the 5-year forecast that had been included throughout the year. Again, there was no express discussion of this in the agenda item that went out. It was a line in a spreadsheet and nothing more than that. So a fairly significant impact on the financial forecast when we begin to address this issue. We took a deeper dive into the financial forecast overall and began to look at what the impacts were. Again, as I've already discussed, we went through pretty in depth of what the proper employer and employee contributions are for the health insurance moving forward and made the proper adjustments to those numbers. But it also forced us to look at some budget assumptions that were made for FY19. The detailed budget spreadsheets that were used to calculate health insurance for FY19 actually carried forward that same methodology of the reduced employer cost and the higher employee cost. So we rectified that. The other thing that was carried forward in the assumption was a 5.66 increase in health insurance costs, and we've now determined that that was a ballpark estimate, if you will, and in reality, the real premium increase is about 3.5%. So we actually, when we worked out the numbers properly for FY19, we actually saw some benefit from that. Again, all of the employer-employee contributions have been recalculated to accurately reflect what their contribution should be and respect the 80-20 split that's spelled out in all of our collective bargaining agreements and what we tell our non-bargaining employees that they'll be paying for health insurance. Again, this is just a snapshot for the record that, you know, the spreadsheets have been corrected to reflect the proper numbers for FY19. As I said, carried through the FY19 budget, we've made the proper adjustments to ensure that we're respecting the 80-20 split that's supposed to be figured in there. But the financial forecast had to be adjusted to account for two things. One is the $250,000 repayment that City Council authorized back to IPBC so that our local health insurance fund was made whole. Secondarily, I had to remove the $450,000 transfer that was indicated in the 5-year financial forecast from the health insurance funds to the general fund. On this slide, you see the comparison of the FY18 budgeted, FY18 corrected, and FY19 corrected health insurance premium amounts. So in that first line going across, you can see where the 80-20 split was adjusted so that the employees were actually paying less than the employer, and again, then how it was recalculated and adjusted to the proper 80-20 split for FY18 and FY19 moving forward. So as we began to look into the issue with the IPBC and the health insurance funds, we started to look at the 5-year financial forecast as a whole, and some other things came to light. We already realized that there was an error in the hotel motel tax calculation, so that was one issue that we had to address. But there were several other revisions that came to light. I'm going to point a few out to you just so that you understand where we sit today and how we came to that point. So building permit revenues were also forecast quite high in that initial 5-year financial forecast. So building permits are forecasted to end FY18 somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000. The projection for FY19 was raised to $561,000. I conferred with the Community Development Department, and we had a conversation about what projects are online for FY19. And at this point, it's not anticipated that they would come anywhere close to that $561,000 number. A more accurate assumption would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $350,000. The other thing we took a close look at is the TIF assumptions in the 5-year financial forecast. So there's a couple of different ways that TIF play into the general fund budget. First, we'll talk about surplus payments. So surplus payments from our TIF districts come into the general fund in two ways. There's property tax surplus and sales tax surplus. We looked at the numbers and we made some adjustments on those. You'll see on the property tax surplus, there was actually a net gain to the city. The reason for that is we actually increased the FY19 realistic number because there's going to be a surplus at some point in FY19. The minimum surplus distribution would be $5.4 million. That does not take into account any of the discussions that have been had recently about the potential for surplusing $11.25 million. That would be the base surplus based on the current existence of TIF2 as it stands today. So that number actually it is a net increase, as I mentioned. However, if you look at the sales tax surplus, those numbers in the forecast, again, were high. I talked to our staff that is involved in the TIF, and they gave me the proper numbers. So when we plug those in, it's about a $118,000 reduction that we see there. Probably the bigger impact is when we talk about TIF transfers. There's been quite a bit of discussion as we've gone through the process of forming TIF 3 on what are appropriate transfers from the TIFs for general fund expenses. And when we went into the 5-year financial forecast, there was a contemplated transfer of $678,000 for FY18 and $558,000 for FY19. We now know that we're using more conservative estimates for what our TIF expenditures should be. So those have been realigned to be $100,000 per year for 18 and 19. And I should note that that adjustment was made in the proposed FY19 budget that was published last week. So those numbers are accurately reflected in the budget, but they had not yet been built into the 5-year financial forecast. So what is the net result of all these issues that we've come across over the past few weeks? We've updated the 5-year financial forecast and project the FY19 budget deficit to be $1.8 million when you're targeting the 25% fund balance policy of the city. I need to point out that this assumes that the $1.7 million in budget balancing measures that have already been discussed by the City Council are adopted. So this is an additional $1.8 million deficit. If the FAC recommendation of 30% of expenditures less property tax revenues were to be utilized, as has been discussed this year, the deficit would increase to $1.883 million, so it's a slightly higher figure. So as we move through the discussion tonight, and Council and FAC have a discussion about where to go with the FY19 budget, there's a few options I'm going to put on the table for you to discuss. One would be to implement additional expenditure reductions. We've already gone through a fairly lengthy list for this year as to what those could look like, but there are others that have been considered and not taken action on so far. The second option would be to implement additional revenue increases. Again, we've talked about what those may be. Third would be to consider adoption of a deficit budget that would utilize fund balance as a short-term measure. And fourth could be any combination of those first three options. And with that, I will leave you to discussion and answer any questions that you have.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Ray. As is the case that we do at most of our council meetings, we certainly try to, is to let our public have some input before we turn it over to the council, and in this case, the council and the FAC. We only have one person who would like to speak to this item on the agenda prior to our discussion, and once again, Mark Charvat.
Boy, oh boy. This town is in a royal mess. These numbers that I just heard just are absolutely shocking. I want to find out, we have a Finance Advisory Committee, which I really appreciate the fact that the city has, and we have dedicated members of this committee. I am somewhat concerned with the fact, in reference to, first off, the $250,000 misappropriation that was just discussed, why our Finance Advisory Committee did not discover this. So perhaps Chairman Peddle can address that at some point in time, or any of the members of the committee. I want to find out who also discovered the misappropriation. I believe this individual needs to be commended. I believe whoever was looking through this and discovered this should be recognized. So I'm appreciative of that fact. I want to find out how these are questions, by the way, that I addressed to the mayor that unfortunately changed his policy, was not willing to read my questions anymore in front of city council. So obviously there's a policy change in reference to emails. How this misappropriation was discovered. I also want to know, and perhaps the Finance Advisory Committee along with the council can address, what steps are being taken to ensure a misappropriation of this amount never happens again. Did we go back and look at previous years in reference to misappropriations in reference to this fund? I mean, how many years back did we go? There might be more in here. The topic of an internal investigation, I stress the word internal, has been discussed. The public is demanding an external set of eyes. Now, I'm aware that there is a once-a-year audit done by an external audit agency, but we need to have other eyes on this budget and go through it. I've suggested a forensic analysis of this. Seem to be getting nowhere with that, but at least an external set of eyes looking at every single thing this city has done financially, at least over the past 10 years. I'm sure there's more hidden things that have not been discovered. I would like to take a moment to also thank our city clerk for bringing up something at the last meeting, and in reference to the quick passage of the transfer of the $250,000. It was considered, seconded, and passed on second reading almost instantly. I believe there is reason in the future, if we do this again, I'm in favor of how the council voted, but I do believe public input, especially with a matter of this importance in the future, if this comes up again, don't just rush this through. Allow the public to address these issues. That's all my comments for now.
Thank you, Mark, and we do appreciate your comments. We have no other member of the public who would like to speak at this point. So thank you, Ray, for giving us that review. Thank you for the comments, and I would now turn it over to any comments from Council or Finance Advisory Committee. Alderman Norrico.
A point of clarification, Ray. When you talk about the local health insurance fund, the library dollars going in, you refer to it as library employee dollars. Does the library as an entity also contribute?
I believe they do, but it's at a much lower rate than the city.
50-50 for HMO? I don't know the exact
Yeah, I mean,
percentage, but they do bill every month.
that isn't critical. I was just wondering if, once again, there's the issue of kind of the commingling of funds, and so it's commingled even further than, as it gets to the city local fund. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Tarasinski.
Thank you, and thank you for the update and the clarifications. The FAC has spent a lot of time looking through that forecast since July. much of that time really working on the $1.7 million budget deficit that we were facing, and spent most of our budget time that was dedicated to the budget aspect discussing those on a pros and cons basis and coming to a set of recommendations that was brought forth. And in looking at the material, I see that the City Council did the same thing and went through the survey and went through item by item. I also noticed that there was a great similarity in the results of the recommendations from the FAC and the City Council in addressing that $1.68 million set of alternatives that was brought forward. So I was pleased with that. Obviously, these setbacks certainly were unanticipated, but for one, I would certainly hope that we would go forward with the recommendations that were made that largely address that $1.7 million. Secondly, I would ask if you have in your slides the 5-year projection as it currently stands, and could you bring it up? Is that possible? Or maybe Bob has it? I don't know. If not, we can read
I
from...
don't have it.
It's
to where I
not
can
part
put
of
it on the
that.
screen. No.
As I understand it, you have updated the 5-year projection that is part of our backup material for this evening,
Correct.
right? And that incorporated all the changes that you brought forward from the insurance standpoint, as well as the errors or adjustments that were made to the hotel motel tax and the other items you identified. And if I understand that, and just reading the document now, head to foot, and looking at where the budget stands for 2019 today, if I just look at that result, we have $37.8 million in revenue, and we have $37.7 million in spending. Let me say that again. We have $37.8 million in revenue, if these numbers are correct now, and $37.7 million in spending. So despite a lot of this 18 stuff and the one-off things that are going to impact fund balance, the operating budget as it sits here this evening is balanced. Is that correct?
I would say that's a fairly accurate statement, yes.
Okay. Because one of the things that really concerned me as reading all this backup material and not have a lot of time to discuss it with a lot of folks is a lot of the things are one-off and they're one-time. Not that any of them are good. Most of them are negative, and the comments around them are severely of a concern. However, that said, most of that's going to affect fund balance, not the operating budget on a go-forward basis. The long-term project that the Finance Advisory Committee had been working on was a 5-year projection, and it took us 2 years to get to a decent 5-year projection. And our objective, I think, largely was at that 5-year projection to get an operating budget that the council could be brought forward to, from FAC at least, that would be balanced for 5 years. That was the primary objective of all those meetings, at least in my case, and I think a lot of our members. And the result of our previous meeting was that we were very close to hitting that objective. We now know, based on this, is that we are nowhere near meeting that objective. But looking at the end of the 5th year, our fund balance drops to $3.7 million from roughly, if you believe the 19 estimate at $9 million, we go to 3.7. So our primary objective is really set back considerably. But that said, at least we, at this point, have a balanced budget to go forward with the recommendations that have largely been agreed to between the two bodies. So I take that as a positive. And dealing with the one-offs and the fund balance remain a significant project that has to be undertaken. But to try and get to an operating budget at a $1.8 million deficit and replace all of those fund balances that were lost largely through the adjustments made through the administrative fees coming out of TIF, which is $1.2 million, right? All of that goes to fund balance. So with that said, I guess I'd leave it at that as kind of an opening set of remarks for further discussion. But further cost reductions to attain 1.8 per year on a go-forward basis would be a difficult challenge. But something in the neighborhood of $500,000 to, $750,000 in my mind would be a great objective. But at least, again, you're starting today with a balanced operating budget.
And you're speaking of the FY19 budget?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Well, you got to put a dent in that fund
Yeah,
balance,
right,
or you're
precisely.
going to continue, the ship is going to continue to sink. I have a couple other comments, but I'll wait for specifics on those.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Tom. Further comments from council or FAC members? Alderman Jacobson.
Just a few questions for clarification before we get into it. I'm confused as to why the 30% minus property tax revenues is actually higher in this budget, and the models we've been seeing earlier, it should be lower slightly, shouldn't it be? As opposed to the 25% flat fund balance.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I would have to look into that further.
Again, when it was discussed to council, and even showing in the backup here on page, what am I on, 13, it shows the skew of what that difference, the unassigned at 25 versus the unassigned at 30, less property tax revenues, and that 30% actually should be a lower amount based on that calculation, as far as I'm aware. So I'm a little concerned to see now that it's somehow higher by $100,000. I think those are actually reversed.
Now, you want a specific page, David?
I am on 13 of the backup, 13 of the 473-page backup.
Okay.
And if you see that general fund balance policy, that was the discussion of the difference between the 25% of total or 30% less property tax revenue. And in the presentation we were just shown now, it showed a $100,000 skew the other way. That if we went to the 30%, it would actually somehow cost us more this year. And I'm just trying to understand why that would be and how that could be. In the numbers that were just presented now, to be clear, I'm trying just to understand what's in and what's out at this point. Admin overhead has been included in that 1.8 number, correct?
Removing the TIF admin overhead, is that what you're referring to?
Shifting it to the general fund budget.
Yeah, it's been reduced to 100,000 per year.
I'm saying that 1.8 deficit includes that expense in the general fund now, the additional that we
Correct.
would have otherwise budgeted. In the projections of that 1.8 is the one-time infusion that would be generated from the declaring of surplus of the 11.25 million. How has that been figured in?
It is not figured in. What is figured into that number is the 5.43. That would be the TIF 2 surplus at the end of this year if we were to not do the 11.25 million surplus. So the 5.43 would be the minimum surplus that we would see this year if no action was taken on that.
Okay. And the only other quick observation I had is on page 31 of the backup, and I think that's something to frame the discussion that's pretty important to understand by the council in understanding the equalized assessed value and the taxes. In sitting up here now for 9 of these, including the 16.5 budget, the goal of almost every council has been to try to cap the property tax revenues at actual growth. And in seeing as how it's laid out here now from 2008 to 2017, that 10-year stretch, our property tax revenue is up over 40%. To understand, again, in breaking down those EAV versus tax revenues, overall, our taxpayers, mainly our homeowners, are still at a 15% overall negative value on their homes from 2007. And again, when you account for inflation and other things, it pushes that significantly higher. But a 15% overall when you add the pluses and minuses, and yet their tax bills are up 40% when we've tried to cap those every year. and tried not to. So whatever we're doing isn't working, apparently. Whatever the direction the council was setting out to do in terms of capping it at incremental growth for at least the last 4 or 5 arguments we've had on this issue isn't working. The tax bills are continuing to soar. We don't have enough to pay our expenditures somehow. And values are still not only stagnant, but negative over that 10-year period. And again, in having this discussion as part of the budget process, some of the answers I was given, well, that was what past councils did. That was the annual, that year, that decision that was made. As far as I'm concerned, we still have a continuing responsibility to the taxpayers to make up for the overtaxing of those years when values were down so significantly, and we were searching for revenues and obviously increasing that millage rate. The reality is the dollars continue to go up significantly, and we still don't have enough to fund our operations. That's not a revenue problem, that's an expenditure problem.
But Dave, none of the property tax dollars go for operations.
Correct.
Okay, so
Again,
so don't make that link.
Expenditures in pensions that are being funded by those property taxes are way out of whack. And rather than fix that structural issue, we continue to try to increase funding rather than finding a way to reduce those pension payments.
How do you propose reducing pension payments that are past liabilities? How do you propose to do that?
At some point, we have to
Declare
fix it.
bankruptcy? That's illegal.
Again, there has to be some options out there.
Approximately 70% of your pension payment each year is catching up with what you owe on past pensions.
Correct.
So I'm not going to
But
let this go.
30% is not. So you're talking an additional probably $1.5 million we could be saving. And it
By
wouldn't be
cutting-
all of that, by cutting all of your employees. But the
Okay.
reality is we can lower that down significantly.
Let's please make sure that that's what the headline reads tomorrow. Jacobson advocates getting rid of all the employees. That's just what you said.
This is the
Dave.
argument, your side of the argument continues to push, Mike. And that's part of the problem, especially as a pension recipient. But the reality is, we need to start working on how
What are you
we start.
talking about?
That's the argument. Rather than having an informed, engaged argument on how we start to reduce those costs, whenever anyone wants to bring it up, the answer is, well, look, the other side just wants to cut everything. No, the answer is, we need to start engaging that discussion, specifically at the FAC level, which you've been on for my entire history here that has not tackled this problem once, and understanding that
Dave, look,
the reality is, going forward, we have to find a way at some point to fix that imbalance. And that
Yes.
imbalance continues to grow significantly.
and why does it continue to grow? The reason is because you, as the most senior member of the city council, know that you have not fully funded the back owed stuff. You need to be increasing your contributions. You need to be taking the actuarial tables, and you need to be funding. The way that you reduce your liability is get rid of those past obligations.
I don't entirely disagree with that. Then the reality
But
is,
you don't have the guts to pass a
then
tax
the
levy
reality
that does
is,
that.
we cannot tie those payments, which are significantly larger than our ability to tax our property tax revenue, to tax property tax revenues.
Tell
And
the
that's
school
courage-
district that.
That is the courage
Tell
that
the
we need
school
to have.
district that, 'cause
is
you're
we need
only
to come up with a
10%.
funding model that our property tax portion, now that it's up 40% and still isn't enough, will never track to an amount that will continue to generate the payments necessary to cover those pension payments, which means our fund balance policy is an impossibility. And as long as it's an impossibility, which continues to push our bond rating down, because we could never go to that amount, and it's the reality of the situation.
Because you have a policy as a council that you will not consider adopting any revenue increases. You have a policy as a council that you won't even increase the amount of the levy by the percentage growth in the EAV. You want to keep the property tax bill flat. You can't do that when your bills are going up. It's going to come time to pay the piper, because the bond rating agencies are going to come in here and they're going to slash our bond rating.
Absolutely, I agree with you there too.
And that's going to just make the problem worse. I don't want to advocate for a large increase in taxes. I don't want to advocate for an increase in taxes, but to take that sort of thing off the table immediately before you start the discussion is irresponsible.
Tom?
A couple things, and I know we could spend the rest of this evening and 3 more hours talking about this topic that has come up every year, of course, and won't go away because it is a long-term problem that is going to be only faced by some kind of growth in revenue at a pace that tries to catch up with the pace of increase, which I think is in the neighborhood, which we've never got a really great number, but I think it's somewhere between 7 and 10% per year, that pension fund actuarial calculation is going to go up. Okay? So that's on a go-forward basis, and we've been paying a higher amount, and we have been funding that higher amount every year. So we have been paying the pension obligation. We have been catching up at a slow rate. However, we've adopted some new criteria and assumptions for pension in the last 2 years, which set that back a little bit, as many communities have, in that they're not getting 7.5% returns. So the obligations haven't caught up at the pace we would like. However, this city has paid at the rate that the actuarial recommendations have come forward since I was on the council and every year forward. They're not 100% paid by property tax, and that has been a bone of contention, and I've raised some issues about that, such as counting the property tax in lieu of taxes that the water department pays to the city. That should be credited along with our existing property tax as a payment toward the pension obligation. I would further take you to the 5-year projection. So if you look at that 5-year projection and you look at the property tax revenue, because the TIFs roll off, and the fact that property taxes are going to be retained back to the city and all the other taxing bodies is significant. So if you look between 19 and 23, you will see over a 50% increase in property tax revenue. Now, why is that happening? I'm assuming the biggest piece of that is the TIF roll-off, right? So I've had discussions with our chair numerous times that on a go-forward basis, our property tax revenue will cover the pension obligations. And some evidence to that effect is right here in front of us. So when you look forward and see that we will be able to take credit for all of the TIF-related property tax that we currently don't take credit for, those payments should be very close, if not cover our pension obligations and maybe even a piece of some of our MRF and some other things. And the pilot's still happening as well. So the discussion, I think, becomes somewhat academic in my view, and I hope, Mr. Mayor, we can move forward on trying to solve the rest of our budget issues as we go forward here.
Thank you, Tom. Alderman Verbeek.
And I think the core to those issues are identifying, again, we have an expenditure issue and a revenue issue. So if we look at our 5-year projection, our personnel or wages are increasing 5 to 5.4% per year. The city of DeKalb does not have that kind of revenue coming into it, so we can already see that we've got some structural issues that we need to get at and find some type of compromise on what does that mean from a level of providing quality services to the community to being fiscally responsible. And I think, you know, we've got our work cut out for us, but it's somewhere in between that we have to figure out what is tolerable for the community to pay for services, and how do we best prioritize those services?
Thank you, Mike. Any further comments?
Sure.
Alderman Jacobson.
There was one thing that I think is very important that Chair Petal mentioned, and I think that we have to be cognizant of that, and that's what the paper should be reporting right now, is that the school district is absolutely taking too big of a bite of the apple. And they need to figure out on their end how, again, to meet their service levels. In reality, they're seeing the same amount of cash influx as we're seeing as the city of DeKalb to run a school district that's a fraction of the size of the city. We're meeting the service burdens of 40,000+ residents, while they're in a fraction of that amount for their services. And while I understand the educational services are certainly going to be more expensive than some of the services we provide, the reality is the school district continues to be the very largest portion of your property tax bill, and there should be some questioning where those dollars are being spent. I appreciate residents coming out and asking us questions and coming to our meetings, but the reality is they need to be at those school board meetings to understand how those dollars are being spent. When you see that they are the largest share overall of your taxes you pay, when you see that they are the largest increase every year, in a bill that is already amongst the top percentage, whichever number you want to call it, in the country, they are the ones driving that cost much more so than the city is. And I think that should be the headline of the paper, is where are those dollars in the school district going, and where else in the community do they need to be going to provide the services for all of our community to not only thrive but survive. And I think that should be the headline in tomorrow's paper.
Amen.
Well, at least we have a couple of headline writers in this meeting tonight, and I appreciate that. Believe me, I appreciate your comments. Moving along, do we want to get down at this point to the nitty-gritty of taking a look at some of the issues that you folks and the FAC, Mike, have talked about, what we have talked about? Because we still have over $1 million that we want to look at. And again, we are not speaking about what I would call the 800, perhaps even more than 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that is our ability, if we choose to move forward this year, in taking a look at dipping into that fund balance. I've advocated for that as a council, as a mayor. I have not gotten full support of that, at least as of tonight, up to tonight, and I'm willing to accept whatever this council and FAC wants to take a look at. But right now, we are in deep doo-doo. We really are, and we need to do some things to try to take a step out of there, in my opinion. Tom, did you want to say something? Or was that just a wry smile on your face?
Well, I was waiting for someone to say something regarding that. A couple things about it. First of all, a couple of my notes go right to the fund balance issues, and they are severe. You know, when you start pulling out the 18 and 19 numbers that you talked about, so the fund balance that you were projecting, you're going to be well short of that in 18, right? Mm-hmm. You made the $250,000 payment. You've cut $600,000-700,000 in revenue by taking off the admin fee from TIF for 18, plus you were in the hole already in 18. I don't know what the latest projection, and I would, there's two specific things that I would like to get action items on, if possible.
Sure.
One is that the airport has regained a significant deficit position in its fund balance. 6 years ago, we wiped that out and paid for it out of the general fund because it was never going to be paid back. We brought it back to zero and said we'd never get back there again. And here we are with a $700,000 deficit fund balance, not operating, but fund balance, that has arisen over the last few years. And that, in my opinion, First of all, when we talk about fund balance, we should be talking about unrestricted fund balance. The 25% goal is the minimum fund balance goal that is unrestricted. The 5-year schedule does not show an unrestricted fund balance. It starts with $9 million, and that number really should be reduced. The CAFR starts at $8.2 million. So if you take the year-end balance, you're already 800,000 short of what the schedule shows, and this shows significant decreases occurring. And part of that reason it's 8.2 is the airport. So that's one item that I think staff has to look at and bring back to council, and I would certainly recommend thinking about zeroing that out and recognizing that that's hitting your fund balance, your unrestricted fund balance.
When you say zero that out, what does that mean?
Well,
from a practical sense, Tom.
Well, in the past, it basically ended up to be an approved transfer at a point in time that the city council made to transfer that money from the general fund to the airport fund and show it on the funds and bring it back to zero instead of a deficit.
Okay.
All right, that's an accounting mechanical thing that has to be approved as a fund transfer. The second one that's really troubling that we did not talk about is what's happening to the water fund. I mean, the water fund is being driven negative across its 3 accounts, which is also a problem. So I had a specific recommendation that we review the water fund with an objective of taking $300,000 out of operating, a go-forward operating number, and $800,000 out of its capital plan, because the capital plan doesn't have enough money in it according to what's in the fund balance. So when you look at your fund balance schedule, it's negative, which is really troubling from an account that had $3 to $4 million in it 3 years ago. I know you've spent some serious capital. I understand that. I'm aware of that. But those 2 things specifically regarding fund balance, and neither one of those are going to help your general fund balance starting position. So when you say spend down the general fund, you already have, and it's a big number. So I don't know that we'll be at 20% fund balance when you do all the math. But the good news is, at least your operating budget as it stands today is not driving down the fund balance further in 19's budget plan as we have it, right?
Yes.
But if we want to, I'm all for taking another look at expenditures, in particular to the tune of $500,000 to $750,000, and I saw that the write-up had some recommendations or at least thought starters along that line.
Mike? Yeah, sure.
A couple of things. Yes, we've got some difficult decisions to make. I would be lying if I didn't say that I was frustrated, but I'm not frustrated at anyone. I'm certainly not frustrated at the city council sitting here tonight. I think that until the last 2 weeks, the budget process has been much more proactive than it has been in past years. And I think the FAC came to some consensus and looked hard. There were a lot of cuts that we bit the bullet and made those cuts. And as Mr. Tarazinski said, the city council did the same thing, and we were more in agreement than we were in disagreement. At the same time, it raises a level of frustration because it is the same kinds of things that we yell about each year, and we're going to continue to yell about that until we win that $1.2 billion lottery prize. But that said, there are a lot of things that are I don't want to necessarily say hidden out there, but I know from the way that city finances work that I observe some things that I know that I'm not sure where they are in the budget. For example, there's been a pretty major project down on Fairview Drive that includes stormwater. Is that a fair statement? Now, stormwater isn't funded anywhere in our normal budget. I mean, we have to come up with that just like any other capital expense, because that doesn't come out of water. True? I mean, we have to find that in the budget. Now, how much is that project on Fairview roughly? And where did the funds come from? Are those just general funds that we've applied there?
My understanding, and Director Holdman can approach the podium, but much of that was grant funding.
I would expect that, yeah.
That project is over $1 million. I think it's in the area of 1.2 million. Approximately 800,000 of that is in grants, and the other, the balance of that is through MFT.
Okay, all right. So we're using motor fuel tax
Yes.
for that.
For the balance.
Okay,
That's-
for roughly 400,000.
Yes, and that's typical of how we use MFT.
Okay.
Typically, it's used as the local share to support the grants. For example, we have a couple of major bridges in out years that need to be repaired. We'll be receiving 80% from IDOT for those, $2.5 million projects, and MFT will make up the 20% local share. That's very typical of how we use MFT, is to leverage the grants.
Not questioning that at all. But again, we have an issue here where we have different kinds of infrastructure that we need to maintain. Street maintenance and streets have been a major issue for a long time. And we understand, I think as citizens, the linkage between what we spend on the streets and the motor fuel tax. I mean, there's a logical extension there.
Yeah.
But the one thing that we don't have is we do not have a logical, rational nexus for funding stormwater. You know, it's something that I think in the longer term, you know, $400,000 is $400,000 that, you know, until very, very recently, that was our full street maintenance improvement budget. So, you know, taking $400,000 for a good use in terms of the stormwater, detention, drainage down on Fairview, you know, I appreciate that living down in that area of the city. But at the same time, I think that in the next budget cycle, we need to take on the issue of having a dedicated funding source for stormwater, because it's one area that we really don't have a logical revenue source that we've devoted to that, and you know, nobody's actually paying in for stormwater, and we have had enough of a problem over the years. It's getting better.
You're spot on. Identification of revenue sources is so critical to us as we move forward. And you've taken a look at it. When I say you, the Finance Advisory Committee, we certainly have. There are some other highlights, if you will, on our matrix tonight where we have some disagreement between FAC and City Council as it relates to funding source. So I would hope that we might be able to reach some kind of consensus tonight going forward on that. Alderman Verbeek.
I think, too, the school district was brought up, and it's time that we start convening governing bodies to find out how we can better share services. How can we put our purchasing power together, for example, on those services that we need? We've got to start looking at some of these options, because we can't necessarily cut our way out of budget issues because we then reduce our services. So how can we maintain those services by sharing in those costs with our other governing partners? And I'm hopeful that whether that's through FAC or City Council, that we really sit down with our partners and figure out what can we do to be more responsible.
Well, keep harping on that. Keep harping on that, because it is important. Collaboration is extremely vital to not only the city, but to the other taxing partners that we have also. Let's face it. I mean, we are in a rat's nest of activity now with our other taxing partners over TIF. We're going to somehow work our way out of that, hopefully, this next week. But that, that also relates into what we're talking about tonight. Those dollars. Where do they go back into the budget? So, good point, Mike. Any further comments? Yes, Alderman Fagan.
Alderman Verbeek brought that up. We discussed that at the beginning of this year. Mm-hmm. And it's not only for the school district. I mean, we got all the taxing bodies that we work with. The county, not only that with the school district, but all the township, everyone. And, if two can live cheaper than one, imagine where we could be with all the taxing bodies, which we've got enough of. But I just wanted to bring that out.
Thank you, Pat. Mr. Parker.
Yeah, the budget process that we've spent, the last 6 months going over, I thought we came up with some real good ideas. It took a lot of time. We spent a lot of time on it and got it to the point where we thought we were real close. Now with these the new information coming forward, while I'm sure the Finance Advisory Committee is willing to take another look at everything, trying to come up with a combination of expenditure reductions and revenue increases of 1.8 million, I think it's going to be pretty tough. So it seems to me that we're going to have to deal with, a reduction in our fund balance moving forward, and hopefully figure out how to, climb back on top down the road. And one of the things that I'm sure that the mayor and the council are well aware of, I think it's real critical that we get this new city manager in place. Quickly would be nice, but correctly would be more important. But getting somebody, that really runs the show is real critical from my perspective on moving forward and getting some of these questions answered.
Yeah, I think we're very, very much aware of that, and I think that was, if you study the background material, that was alluded to, the fact that, one of the things we might want to do, whether that be dipping into the fund balance, whether that be establishing a budget which is in a deficit position, whether or not we do this, that, or whatever, that it's important that the new person coming in as city manager is critical. I don't think we're going to be in a position to do anything that's going to, tie that person's hands, but I think the point is well taken. Mike, or Steve, thank you. Yeah, Alderman Tom, former Alderman Tom, yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
A couple, and I'm afraid we may not get very specific here the way this conversation is going. Again, in the backup material, they talked about a couple actions that I thought were relevant. One of them was freeze hiring. That has been a recommendation from the FAC in a couple years going back, and was recommended to the council as a way to control the head count issue, particularly since you're looking at a new city manager and you're looking at, on a go-forward basis, a $500,000 to $1 million operating budget going forward, even though 19 will be okay. I would suspect there wouldn't be a lot of support for freezing hiring, including boots on the ground for the FOP. But setting that aside, the idea of freezing hiring in the sense that it occurred before was every hire had to come to the city council and be approved individually. And therefore it was never approved in the budget per se. it was approved specifically and explicitly when the city manager and her staff had so much ammunition to have the guts to bring it forward. And with the exception of FOP, I think that is a reasonable recommendation. I would, the FAC has not voted on that, but I think that has merit. This idea of the 25% fund balance is an explicit recommendation by the FAC again this year, and it was specifically taken up in our last meeting to make sure that it was recommended to council to maintain that as a minimum goal. Your bond rating is completely, not completely, but largely influenced by that aspect of having a fund balance that's reasonable. And getting back to that number should be a high priority of anybody who's interviewed for the city manager's spot, with an understanding of what's in this 5-year forecast. The other thing I would suggest, and again, we haven't voted because this is all new, is remember that a year ago we said keep the budget open. It's open to amendment at any time by the city council. The budget can be amended. And if you keep working at $500,000 to $1 million, or you assign us to work on a project to identify and go through these again, if we have to, we have to. There's nothing saying we can't amend this budget in February or March with a new city manager and say we're going to attack this thing and come up with some additional resolution if we can't get to it in the amount of time left. But you certainly could keep it open for an amendment.
And that would more likely than not require a deficit budget being passed.
Well,
by
again,
the end of the year.
you don't have a deficit budget. Your budget's balanced right now for 19. It's balanced. What you've got is a deficit in your fund balance, but your operating budget is balanced.
Right. Yeah, Mike?
And with that thought in mind, some people who have been around me for a few years will probably faint when I say this, but you know, increasingly, this is a really, really, really complex issue that, again, we've been forced to deal with under extreme time constraint. Okay. Look, I'm realistic. There's nothing we're going to do about that property tax levy. I mean, we've already had some announcement of the levy, and there's, you know, the city council has taken up the levy. If you want to increase the levy, great, but I'm not expecting that from a political or a financial standpoint. Mayor Smith, you know, with respect to the issue of hiring a new city manager, I'm not throwing my arms up, but I honestly believe that the best option might be to go ahead and adopt the balanced budget with the reduction in the fund balances, with the understanding that this is a temporary action, that there are going to be some things that are going to improve. I have no doubt about it. But we're going to get into arguments when you try to go through $1.8 million of spending cuts or revenue enhancements that are well beyond the scope of being able to do it in a meeting like this under a short period of time. And, you know, tempers can fly. You know, I'm frustrated, you know, but the bottom line is I think we have a better chance in terms of doing what is right for the city by going ahead in the short term and balancing the budget with the fund balances. In other words, drawing down those fund balances, but recognize that, you know, we don't even want to live 6 months into the fiscal year without amending that budget and finding a way to do things when we have a much clearer idea of where things are going, but also, in addition to that, that we have an idea of how, with careful thought, not 2 weeks, we can come up with something that is not only workable for FY19, but is sustainable and allows us to get where we need to go with the 5-year plan.
Alderman Enrico.
I support the idea of doing a short-term, quote-unquote, fix, and then working with the new city manager on proposals, ideas that will address some of these long-term issues with the caution. We can't expect someone to come in and in, a couple of weeks, a couple of months, to have the magic bullet. I mean, it's, I honestly believe that choosing the right city manager, we will get fresh ideas and we will get, a fresh perspective that will help us. But we shouldn't, tie that person's success to solving these financial issues, which have been around for a long time. The pension issue, which is just this huge albatross and elephant, and I don't what else, but bottom line, as I said, I think we can get some new perspective. And because I, even valuing, the input of FAC and the council, we're pretty close to tapped out. Not only tapped out, but somewhat entrenched in our positions. Not that any of us are stubborn or anything, but I think, somebody new in the mix will also be able to point out, ways to re-energize us.
Alderman Verbeek.
But Mayor, I would ask that that 6-month amendment period be policy in some way. We will have a council changeover in the spring, and I want us to adhere to that balancing amendment measure within 6 months. How do we do that? How do we set that as policy? So, we talked about it last year, as Tom brought up, going back, amending the budget, balancing what was a deficit budget. How can we assure ourselves of doing that?
And how do we do that? How do we do that?
That's a good question.
Alderman Jacobson.
We had this discussion last year.
Right.
And we agreed to do this last year.
Right.
There's one word for what I'm hearing here. It's laziness. The people here don't want to make the difficult discussion, or take the difficult discussions. That's the reality. To say, let's kick it down the can 6 months and hope in 6 months you can catch up is twice as hard. Well, now we have the entire year to cost out some of those things. Now you're going to force the next council to deal with it on a 6-month time frame, which will be absolutely impossible, if it even comes up. Obviously, again, looking at this budget, understanding how it was done last year, laziness. You were all lied to. And I screamed up here a year ago that your city manager was lying through her teeth to you, that it was an impossibility her numbers showed up to a balanced budget. And there were people on the FAC that were hinting at the same thing, that it was an impossibility for some of these things to occur that were budgeted for. And the council decided, rather than make cuts, and rather than discuss revenue enhancements, that we would let it fly through the budget and allow it to show as balanced, with the understanding that we would keep the budget open and keep working on it. 11 and a half months have gone by. We're in the same position, and now we're saying, well, let's wait for the new people to come, whether it's staff or council, and they're going to come in just as our previous city manager did, and said, well, I can't do this in my first year. I need to get an understanding of the budget. I need to understand how revenues and expenditures are collected. We're going to have a new council. They're going to have different attitudes. They are not going to be up to speed by any means to jump right into a budgeting process, as the council members now understand that we just finally got the numbers now to get everybody up to speed to really understand it. Again, taking fund balance is laziness. This is an emergency fund for a legitimate emergency. Our council that Tom and I sat on had to make specific cuts and hold back on expenditures from his entire term and the term before me even to have that fund balance. And the goal and the discussion and the entire purpose of that fund balance was so that we didn't get back to we were in 08 and to a point where we had no day-to-day fund reserves and couldn't fund our operations. The 25% target was set because that is what our bond rating agencies said was a minimum for the size of our community. So to go below that minimum as one of your cardinal financial policies, when your other cardinal financial policy is that you will fully fund your tax levy with your property taxes, your two most important fund balance policies, you are now telling the bond rating agencies, nah, they're not that important because we're too lazy to sit down and do the work. That's the reality here. We have another $1.8 million in cuts to get to. That's where we need to be. That is the honest way to balance this budget and to keep the fund balance where it needs to be. To waste fund balance because it's the easy path, I would caution strongly against. Knowing why it's there, knowing how it was funded, knowing the difficulty it took to fund that to the 25% balance. Unless you have an absolute plan that is laid out and shows exactly how you will pay that money back in the very near term, it's laziness.
Ron, I'll get right to you. I think, Dean, you had something. Dean Fraders, our legal counsel.
Yes, Mayor. So the question was asked, how would the council commit to a policy of reviewing the budget?
That was my question.
And I think there's a technical answer and a practical answer. The technical answer is the city could adopt another financial policy that requires that process to occur. The practical answer, though, is adopting a policy is only as effective as the city's compliance with it. So where this council and the FAC have had success in adhering to goals of that nature or meeting goals, if you look at our past practices, it's been more closely aligned to when you've set specific timelines instead of adopting a policy saying we want to get the council and the FAC together for X number of meetings in the first quarter of 2018 and X number of meetings in the second quarter, and then you direct us as staff to go back and pick those dates and get them in front of you for approval. And where you have laid out a concrete plan like that, such as at the end of the preparation for the FY18 budget, the council and FAC said very clearly, we want more meetings together, here's the timeline, we coordinated them and they happened. If you do that earlier in the process and say now we want that to happen at the start of calendar year 2019, that would be an effective mechanism to ensure that we're following that direction.
Well, you know, I know that stuff happens, but believe me, if you recall, we had this same conversation a year ago, and we said we're going to start earlier, which I think we did. We did. We did, okay? And it wasn't until the stuff started hitting the fan 6 weeks ago or something that we find ourselves with a larger number than what we were talking about just several meetings ago. So I think we have to be careful not to beat up on ourselves too badly. Okay? Ron.
Thank you, Mayor. I was going to say kind of the same thing. I think we need to deal with the problem, not the people. We don't want to veer. It feels like we've gone 2 steps forward and now 3 steps back. As part of the Finance Committee, I've always been against dipping into the fund reserve. However, we talk about headlines. People want to wake up tomorrow and know that we've hit a wave, the city's secure. I'd be all for dipping into the fund reserve. I don't know where the rest of the committee would stand on that. Short term, I think we get too hung up on the written, we need to have policies and a deadline, but I think it's in a process, not an event. And I think to think we're going to turn this around over and it's not going to happen. We have talked about that 25%. We've been strong advocates of it. We have certainly discussed the frustration. We make recommendations, which the city may or may not follow, but the reality is we're facing what we're facing, and we've gotten some very good and accurate numbers. Thank you, Mr. Munch, for that, and Mr. Miller. But yeah, at this point, I'm okay. I'd be willing to look at dipping into the fund balance.
Yeah, Mike.
Actually, I think Alderman.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, I wanted to ask my colleague, Alderman Jacobson, used a phrase a few moments ago, revenue enhancement. What ideas do you have for revenue enhancement, Dave, since you brought it up?
We've talked about several, and we have asked for more information on several of those. And again, now when we look at our 5-year plan, again, this isn't a one-time dipping into the fund balance to cover us for this year. We have no plan to refund it. Not only do we have not a plan to refund it, but it continues to drop in our 5-year forecast now.
Well, and I understand
this isn't a one-time issue. It's a structural imbalance in what we have going on here.
I understand that, Dave, but my question is, what revenue enhancements would you foresee us being able to use? And identify them, please.
We discussed them at the last meeting, what those options
identify them. That's what I'm asking. I'm asking you to identify which ones you find.
Again, those are the discussions we need to have.
All right, so in other words, you're saying you don't have any idea because you can't identify any of them.
The amusement tax would be one of them that we've discussed. And we've said we need NIU to step up. We need NIU to start looking at how they're funding some of their obligations of the services we're taking. And we've made no attempt to do so this year. We can look at some of the other fee increases that we've talked about, that we had some decent discussion last time and said that we want to get back in front of us, and we've now gone a month without having those discussions.
Well, but I think, though, that what we've done already is agreed on some of those ones that we've talked about previously, but now let's go beyond the ones that we've already talked about and agreed to, both internally to council, internally to FAC. Identify something else that you see as something we could use as a revenue enhancement that we haven't already discussed.
I would lean more heavily on NIU. I would discuss some of those co-sharing of costs. We've talked about additional SSAs to cover some of the costs and other things going on. And without having the benefit of those numbers, you could throw the Bill Finucane tax. What does it mean? How much does it cost? What does it generate? Let's pass the Bill Finucane tax. It doesn't mean anything because we haven't been given the data to have those informed discussions. And I appreciate right now things have been difficult here, but again, the show must go on as far as I'm concerned. If we need additional help, then that's what we should have here. And there are some discussions in this memo today and talking about doing a hiring freeze for at least 6 or 12 months. That would get us a big chunk of that money to save. That is a difficult decision that now cuts that deficit in half.
That's on the expenditure cuts.
Correct.
What about
we're now just all coming to the agreement, well, let's leave because we're going to use fund balance. There's other options in here.
Well, I know
whether
it,
they're
and
expenditures
I'm not
or
in favor of using fund balance, and I think you feel the same way on that. But again, revenue enhancement, what are we going to look at? Are we going to look at a sales tax increase? Are we going to look at, you mentioned amusement tax.
We now find out that sales tax increase that we discussed at a prior meeting a month ago was way off in focus. Again, we need those numbers to have an informed discussion. And in just throwing up our hands saying, let's lose fund balance and we'll try to figure it out later, well, that's laziness.
That's my point.
Then let's schedule some meetings. We have lots of time between now and December 31st when we have to pass this thing. If we have to meet every night and have staff or bring in someone to cover those numbers and start presenting those numbers to us, both us and the FAC, if they want to step up and do it, in reality, the buck stops with us. And if that means we have to meet every night between now and December 31st, and we have to bring in someone short-term to come up with those revenue projections and show us what the options look like and show us what the possibilities are, so be it. I'm prepared to make that commitment. If everyone else here says, let's use fund balance so we can go home early, that's your choice.
I didn't hear anybody say use the fund balance so we can go home early. Also, I think using terms like laziness is your value, maybe, not the reality. I think we're talking reality of the short term. And, this has been a process along. We've worked on this for a few years. We did start early, and so nobody's happy to have this dumped in our lap. But I think you have to be careful when you use terms like laziness, because then you're projecting your own value on that, and maybe some of us are prepared to sit here all night. Well, look at what's the reality. The city doesn't want to wake up to panic and mayhem tomorrow and find out that there's going to be no services because you want to balance, you know what I'm saying? It's like, it's a process, and it's a lengthy process, and it's going to involve some hard work, but this is our city. We're all dedicated here to be here and work for it, not to be pointing fingers. I think, going with problems is not, or with people, I'm sorry, is not the solution. I think you go with the problem at hand. Thank you.
Mike, and then Kate.
First of all, I'm not upset with using the term laziness. You and I have been on the same side on that particular issue. I've used gutlessness, et cetera. But this is a challenge, and there are. This is a comment about the future. I don't want to rev this issue back up. When it comes to the bond rating, okay, the property tax is very special when it comes to making the bonding agencies feel better. Even if you do revenue enhancement, unless it's reliable and stable to the extent that the property tax is, they're not going to look at it the same way. That said, I'm not really comfortable that that I know how to close a $1.8 million gap, and let's say that I'm on board to do it with cuts. I'm not confident that I can do that, and it's not a matter of being chicken, and it's not a matter of laziness. I tend to want to try to be careful and to know what the implications are. And anything that we bring forward at this particular point is something that will not have seen the light of day for a significant period of time. Now, I understand that we're likely not going to take votes on the options that we're choosing. But there's a reason why you have first reading and second reading of ordinances in a municipality, and it's for this very reason, that you don't sit down like the Illinois General Assembly has and make decisions in a 15-minute period before midnight. This is too large and too important an issue to not do carefully. If we can do it carefully, more power to us. But we do, I think, have to, number one, protect the integrity of the process. Number two, recognize that anything related to personnel, you're dealing with people. And there's a person at the end, and I'm not saying you don't make cuts, but you do them very judiciously and very, very thoughtfully. And though I sympathize with the argument of laziness, you know that I just do not have a record of supporting doing this sort of thing of taking things out of fund balance. But I'm against the wall right now, and I think that it's the best option. But I can be convinced otherwise.
Alderman Norrico.
In terms of revenue enhancements, there was one proposed tax increase that FAC said yes and the council said no. And that was the restaurant, bar, and packaged liquor tax increase. And, I had, even in our discussions, had commented favorably on that only, well, I don't know if only, but at least partially because I saw those purchases as discretionary. And while nobody likes to be the face of tax increases, again, I think it's something that FAC carefully thought through, and I would encourage the council to take another look at it, especially given this situation we're facing.
And that was one of the items, if you recall, where even at council, it was split. It was almost 50-50. So I agree. We also have to keep in mind that in the backup material, there are 3 revenue-enhancing measures, that being one of them. If we were to all utilize all 3, and of course the big one is the sales tax increase, the home rule sales tax, we've got that 1.8 wiped out, right?
We'd have to look at the numbers very carefully. One of the things to keep in mind.
Home rule sales tax increase, $1 million. Restaurant, bar, and packaged liquor tax increase, $480,000. Property tax capture of full EAV growth, $257,594. And I realize that when we were talking about EAV growth, I think this council feels that we ought to take a look at the actual 0.2% growth of new construction. So your point is well taken. Tom?
Trying to get to a point of decision-making regarding this. The one other thing I had on my list, if the FAC was going to be tasked, if the council so wanted the FAC to be tasked and work on a joint list of the recommendations here and how to fill this gap on a go-forward basis, I don't know that you need $1.8 million in one fell swoop.
No, I'm not suggesting we do.
No, I'm just looking at that 5-year forecast. We're balanced in 19. We look at a $750,000 deficit in the second year, which we all want to wipe out and get this thing balanced on a go-forward basis. But if we were tasked to do that and you left the budget amendment process open, I don't know that there's enough meeting time, and without a finance director and you have you have some other things to consider as to what the finance department's going to do and how it's going to go at it. But I think given some time in the first quarter, I don't know why we couldn't continue to meet on an assignment to come up with those actions, including looking at the revenue piece as well, as long as we have some support with the number crunching to do that. I think the FAC members would probably be maybe okay with doing that, because that's what we've been tasked to do all along here, is to answer this 5-year projection target.
Your economic development planner, Jason Mitchnick.
I just wanted to make a quick point of clarification in regards to the figures that have put in there for the revenue enhancements. With sales tax specifically, there is a period where we would have to meet a deadline with the state, so those numbers are full years. So an example would be the sales tax, the $1 million, but that would be for a full year of a 0.25% increase. But in FY19, we would only be able to realize a 6-month increase because we would have to register that with the state, and we wouldn't start collection for that until July. So there's specific revenues, and what we can do is we can work on, what that would actually look like for FY19 based on when we'd be able to implement that.
So what I had purported is not really the case.
For FY19, correct.
Yeah, for FY19, right. Alderman Fagan?
I'd like to hit on a couple things. First off, the term laziness, we're not here at $1.8 million on November 20th because we were lazy. It was for other reasons and was not for anyone here. The second thing is, it seems like we're going down the path here of getting into the fund balance and addressing this later, as Mr. Tarazinski said. I would like to see, and I feel really good about these meetings, and unfortunately we only meet one time a year. I suggest, so that we're not pushing it, not addressing it, that we put it on our calendar that we meet with the FAC 4 times a year, possibly, especially right now where we're at. So we are addressing this in the first couple months of the year, and we're going down and meeting here, and we put it on the calendar, and we've got a date set on that. The other thing is, Mr. Tarazinski said, the hiring freeze. I'm sure we can get that on council and I'm sure that's been addressed. I know Alderman Verbeek has addressed items that when we've gone to hire people that haven't really been able to have a say-so on it, and that's one way to be able to do that. So I think we'll be able to bring that to council also.
Mr. Hagerson.
I'll go with Mr.
Oh, that's
I think I would caution these groups to follow the procedures. I think you get in trouble when you go out in a hurry, when you go outside the procedures. You're dealing with people. All this is not money, it's people. It deals with people's careers and people's lives and all the things. Take your time, do it right, give it the proper respect and the proper consideration with it. I feel like the FAC did that for the first 96, only to find out we're not even halfway there with the issue. So I want to give the same amount of consideration to that amount that we did to the first. And to rush it, I think, would be a terrible mistake. That's how you make mistakes.
Alderman Jacobson.
To be clear, a hiring freeze wouldn't affect any existing people right now. It's an $800,000 cost savings of vacant positions right now that you would hold for the year until you can come up with how to pay for them. Again, at this point, just a couple months ago, we were talking about potentially raising sales taxes to add police officers on the front lines right now, and now we're seeing it wouldn't even cover the gap we have with our existing officers. Again, in saying that this is lazy, it's the lazy decision now. I appreciate the amount of time that we've put into the budget this year. We've put in a significant amount of time, more so than probably any other year I've done it, both FAC and council, to understand the budget, to do those things. I'm not saying the process was lazy. I'm saying now that we have options that, again, are in some cases don't affect people. This is the discussion we're having, and instead we're having a discussion over, let's just use fund balance and figure it out later. I would appreciate meeting with FAC more often. Again, before we had our last round of cuts, to understand some of the discussion you had and to understand some of the recommendations you made without the benefit of you in the room, I thought was unfair, especially to you guys and certainly to us, and not understanding what just a simple vote on a survey meant. Again, the frustration at this point is basically staff is manipulating the process.
What was that?
Staff is manipulating the process. And it was done last year by intentionally over-computing revenues. And we knew that. And we had that discussion, that we weren't going to sell the resident officer's house, that we weren't going to be able to get the TRIP agreement done, that we weren't going to be able to do many of those things that were included as revenue that were phantom numbers. This isn't a surprise at the last minute, at the 11th hour. You knew about this as the council 11 and a half months ago.
But you're one of the council persons.
And I made it very clear at that time that in doing it was a mistake. And that in doing it last year, we were overstating the revenues to claim we had a balanced budget, and it was fallacy. And the council continues to pretend that the things they're getting from in front of them are reasonable and realistic when they're not. And again, in having this discussion that we're just going to wait another couple months, I don't trust that we can get this done in that amount of time. The reality is, now is the budget time. We've moved it into this 12-month cycle from a summer cycle purposely to have these discussions earlier in the year. We know we have a major funding gap, and a lot of it was caused, again, not by the FAC, by the council's unwillingness to have those discussions a year ago. Now we're in the same position, saying we'll have them in another year. At some point, again, either it's revenues or it's expenditures. So let's start having those discussions. I mean, the reality is we have 45 days before we have to get this thing done. It's uncomfortable. It's going to be a time burden on us. Let's start seeing some of these numbers and see what our options are.
Alderman Noriko, and then Alderman Fagan.
I think it does a disservice to city staff to say that we have been manipulated this time. Acting City Manager Munch came forward and I felt was very direct in saying, this is what happened with the IPBC funding. We went back and looked at other figures and have revised these figures. And all the arguments in the world about, you know, when this could have been done, should have been done. But the reality is now, he stood up there when, you know, he very easily and has been, you know, maligned and castigated for that. However, you know, I think has made a very, you know, concerted, direct effort to be as honest as possible with, you know, FAC and the council. And the numbers, pardon the expression, suck. You know, that's the only way to say it. And we are faced with difficult decisions. But we aren't avoiding the decisions at this point. We had previously, you know, honest discussions, thrashing out how we could reduce that deficit, and now we have figures and we have more issues to face. And you know, I think saying the word problems is loaded, but you know, that's what they are. And nobody's avoiding making decisions, but I think, you know, as has been pointed out, we can't just go like that making decisions. And I'm confident that we will come up with a process that will address these issues. And maybe you don't feel the same confidence, but I think to keep, you know, saying that we can't do it, we won't do it, is not furthering the process.
And to your point, it was 6 weeks ago or less before some of the numbers that we saw were bogus. Let me spell it. B-O-G-U-S.
Yep.
Bogus. Now, and we were $242,000 this close
Yes.
to coming back and saying, okay, these are the things that we need to take a look at, including those are the things, some things that we said, no, we don't want to mess with that. But FAC had said, yeah, you should take a look at that. Had we just done that with $242,000, fine. But the stuff hit the fan. Some of the numbers were bogus. And so the report that Ray gave us tonight gives us this slightly larger mountain to climb out of, or to climb. I just want to make it a point that it isn't like we've been vacillating on this and we've been dragging our feet to the tune of $1.8 million since last January.
Right.
Alderman Fagan?
I agree. That's what I was trying to say before. You know,
I mean, I took the words out of your mouth?
Yeah, you did a great job at it, though. You know, but the other thing is, and I'm going to hold back a little bit because I'm going to feel like I'm doing nothing but arguing, and I don't want to do that. We can't get anywhere with that tonight. But the city staff, as Alderman Jacobs says that it's hiding from us or whatever. We don't have much staff left. As a matter of fact, if it wasn't for this staff, we wouldn't even know about the 1.8 million. And to try to recoup 1.8 million, I'm getting a census here that we don't want to rush a judgment on this. I mean, that's, we can get ourselves into a dangerous situation. You know, rather than stepping back, evaluating everything, meeting again, having more thought about it. Nothing's going to get done here and on a Tuesday night to make up the 1.8 million.
Mr. Peddle.
I think that, and I'm not going to pick on anybody in particular, but this has been a recurring theme for about a year, maybe more. And I think, given the stage at which you're at in hiring a new city manager, I cannot help but comment that some of the things that have been said about city staff would lead me, if I were a candidate, to never even consider the city of DeKalb, from, you know, deliberately misleading the city council to only in it for their own self-interest. Those kinds of things are not helpful. The staff is here to help, and yeah, I have a vested interest in terms of training people that are like the people that you hire for the city staff, but I recognize the value of professional leadership and professional management. And there was a memo a while ago from the city attorney about the budgetary process and about the various responsibilities of staff and the city council. And you just need to be very, very careful that you provide not only a good place to live and to do business, and the city should be a good place to work, but also the municipality, the government, should be a good place to work where people respect each other. Now, I think it's, you know, disrespectful that staff did not come to the city council for approval and discussion of a lot of the things that we learned at the beginning of the meeting. And you know what's funny is if staff had come with and done that, I have a feeling that a significant portion of this would have been approved by the city council. So this wasn't just a big nefarious scheme of trying to take money for personal gain, or at least it does not appear to be, pending investigation. So at this stage, we are a council manager form of government, and we need to have a city administration. I use that generically to talk about the council, the staff, committees, the commissions. We need to have a group that works together and is pulling in a common direction. Yes, the city council needs to give direction to staff, but the city council is not responsible for the day-to-day administration of the city. And you need to get a good manager in here who's going to be a leader, and that may mean that you have to pay more than the $60,000 that some people had talked about it at one point in the process. You know, good help is very valuable. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. Alderman Jacobson.
Again, I think some of the things I'm saying are being misinterpreted. It's certainly not putting this on Ray at this point. He was thrown into the job 7 days ago with, I don't even know an appropriate way to say the words I'm thinking, a storm brewing around him, and has come out of it, again, in a week's time, and looking at some of the things that were prepared for this memo. I appreciate some of the time that he was able to put in. The reality is that looking at this deficit, it's not next year we're facing it. As Tom said, we're effectively balanced. It's this current fiscal year that's creating that major budget gap. And an understanding that this budget process was done a year ago, when there were certain things denoted as issues in the budget, as false revenues. while I appreciate that there is value in working together, it is the council's primary objective to represent the citizens as an oversight of city staff. We are the leaders in this community, represented to be the voice of the community and how things go on in this building. And it was the abdication of that duty. It was the abdication of doing a line-by-line budget last year that many council members specifically said they did not want to do to understand the inner workings of the budget. They merely trusted that the person running the ship a year ago was professional and great. But there is more value in accountability to understand what that person did to us and was allowed to leave this community to go out in the field and look for other jobs, when we understand that she did intentionally skew numbers in the budgeting process to mislead the council into believing that we were balanced, when we understand that she did intentionally add and fix budget line item numbers in revenues to show we had more money in the accounts to balance this year than we did, and that was a specifically targeted and directed process of doing so. And when the council was alerted a year ago, they took no action. They threw up their hands and said, we'll spend some more time over the course of the next 6 months figuring it out, and then did not take that time to do so. This is an accountability issue. The current stuff is a communication issue. The accountability issue falls on all of the council members. A year ago, when we had this discussion, the attitude was, we're balanced, we're good, everything's awesome, pat ourselves on the back, we figured it out, because all the numbers make sense, without understanding what any of those numbers meant. That's the council's fault. This isn't a 6-week surprise. This answer was given to us a year ago, and the council refused to do their due diligence and understand it. When there were members of your council telling you, hey, this is coming, I'm telling you the same thing again. This isn't a crystal ball. This is what's in front of us. This isn't magic. This isn't some, I got lucky and had a guess. Step up and do your jobs. The reality is, we knew about this 12 months ago. So to blame it on 6 months or the staff that's sitting in the room now, that's fallacy. Stop making excuses. Step up and be accountable, both to your job and your title and to the people you represent. And if you're not willing to do that, if you're not competent enough to make the difficult discussions, whether as a council or an FAC member, then you don't belong in this room going forward. And I think that's the reality you all have to swallow at this point. Either step up and do it the right way, or this will continue to happen. As Chair Peddle said before, every year we have the same discussions. You're circling the bowl every year because you won't fix the structural issues that we face in this community. And then we make decisions like buying buildings we can't afford when we were told we could. Because someone told you we could, you believed it. Going out and buying software for a new financial package that we couldn't afford. That the city manager at the time intentionally delayed the discussions of the council to ensure that she got her software package that she wanted in. And intentionally, and went out and did that purposefully. So either you're lazy, or you're negligent, or you don't belong in the room. It's one of those three things. You choose. I don't mind. If you want to step up again and saying, well, let's have the discussion of what we're going to do, fine. Then let's schedule 4 additional meetings between now and the end of the year to step up and specifically discuss this $1.8 million thing, issue we have, whether it's at the FAC level or at the council level, or preferably both. We can set 4 meetings tonight to go through it and to discuss 2 of those meetings expenditure reductions and 2 of those meetings revenue enhancements. And we'll put the time and energy we need over the next course of the month to doing that. If you don't want to do that, if you fail at doing that, that's not you saying, well, we had an option and we didn't have any other option. You now have an option. Either step up to that option or be lazy. Those are your options.
Oh, that's baloney.
Then you don't want to meet. And
No.
that is the decision you made.
What you have given a very warped view of a city council.
The numbers don't lie. The numbers don't lie. The numbers are what we said they were a year ago, and they are those that way.
Do you have any responsibility? Do you have any fiduciary responsibility?
Absolutely we do.
Okay. You have a fiduciary responsibility to the city.
To the taxpayers.
No.
Our constituents, not to the employees.
No, that's
And I
not-
appreciate as an employee that you don't like that answer. Our responsibility as elected officials are to the voters.
To me as an employee.
You have lived your life and your career as an employee from that mentality, not
Oh,
from,
my God.
from
Oh,
the other
thank
side
you.
of things.
Well, you know,
But I
I'm just
appreciate
really
that. Our
glad
responsibility is to the taxpayer and the elector, the voter. That's our
Not
responsibility.
solely. No, it's not. And if, anyway.
Lynn, did you have something to say?
I'm going to chew some more gum.
You're going to what?
Chew some more gum.
You're going to chew some more gum.
Yeah.
At the risk of throwing
One more
another
quick comment. We still have not talked about streets and fleet. Again, something we've known not just for 12 months, for the last 4 or 5 years. And yet, we still, through this course of this meeting, now a month before passing the budget, we have made no effort to address any of our streets and fleet issues in this community. And using fund balance just to cover operations, we have no plan at all in front of us to do that.
I want to get to Will Heinisch. Will, you came up here in the middle of the discussion.
Thank you, Mayor.
Yeah.
I enjoy being thrown into the cats fight and into the ring. So, but what I wanted to briefly touch on is, you know, the last meeting that was at the budget, I thought we were close, and I felt good that we had made the cuts, and then to get to this point, extremely frustrating. But I don't want to throw in the towel either. And I think we need to split that mountain in half. And I think when I read the backup material earlier today, it made a lot of sense, whoever presented it. And I think all of you have brought forth some good ideas. And I think one key one here is the hiring of the city manager going forward, and they might have some insight and some changes. And I'd like to give that city manager some flexibility and maybe take a different look at it. And they're not going to be able to do that within probably the first 30 or 60 days. At the same time, when I look at one of the recommendations is freeze hiring for $811,000 for 12 months, that would go a long way and put a dent. And I think give the city manager some flexibility to realign. And at the same time, it still allows the council, if you did the hiring freeze for 12 months, that if you really needed somebody, you can do a budget amendment. We just talked about, and Dean mentioned that. And that if you needed somebody, you find the money at the time. So I think you need to come to agreement and try and work and at least put a foot forward, but not to anything too rash. You know, I said 6-8 months ago, we're falling in a big, black, deep hole. I just read a documentary on Dalton, Illinois, and I'll forward it to the council. But I'm afraid DeKalb is going to become the next Dalton. And if you don't understand Dalton, the Cliff Notes version is their manufacturing, their workforce, their base is completely declined, and now their city is completely in rumble. NIU I consider as a manufacturer. We've lost half of our manufacturing. We've lost companies such as Wurlitz or GE and the companies and the peripheral companies that bring people and employers, and that's what stays, and that's what Dalton lost. We need to bring more businesses into DeKalb, and we need to focus on bringing businesses and growth. Growth has been flat the last 10 years, but our expenses has gone up. My concern too is raising the sales tax. It puts us higher. Businesses aren't going to want to come when we're higher than everybody else. When you have Rochelle that's at 7%, Ottawa at 7%, Oregon at 7.25%, and even my competitors are at 5.5% and 6.25%. I can't survive in the town if we raise sales tax. So we need to make this town and want people to come here to grow our business and hopefully grow our way out of it. But growing our way out of it, we do need to freeze expenses at the same time. That's what's gotten us in trouble the past decade and 20 years is we've continued to spend future revenues. And that's what's finally caught up when growth stopped the last 10 years. I think we all need to take a deep breath. I would recommend doing a 12-month freeze with the option of doing budget amendments, and maybe you do dump into the fund balance and try and take at least a half stab at it. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Will. Okay. If we have no other recommendation tonight, hopefully our city council has heard the discussion tonight, and we need to move forward with the caveat that if Alderman Jacobson's recommendation that we meet further with the FAC, and 4 times between now and the end of the year, Dave, seems to me to be a stretch, but if that makes some sense, I think we should probably at least consider that. But I'd be open to any comments. If not, I'm prepared to move on to the tax levy consideration. Any thoughts? Alderman Favor.
I would agree to meet. I don't know if 4 is going to work out, but to meet a few additional times to try and hammer this out. I would like to see if we don't get the full 1.8, potentially, as Will had said, cut it in half, or I would like to see what else we could do. I'd like to have that discussion.
Well, the firing freeze, for example, would cut it in half. I mean, I'm just throwing that out now. So, Mike, good buddy, good friend, what do you think of a couple of extra meetings between now and the end of the year?
That's up to the committee.
Is there some consensus that if we do that, we have, do we have a quorum issue if we do this moving forward? What I'm thinking of is, even though we may not get this austere group together every time, are we running the risk of not having enough folks here? I know, Dave, you go on vacation for a week next week, right? So you wouldn't be here. And I can't imagine a meeting without you. But what do you think? Where do we want to go here? Any Tom?
I'm not against meeting once or twice if we can have an agenda, and again, it's the preparation of staff trying to get this done. You have to adopt in a budget, and you have to pass a levy. You've got a lot on your table, plus these audits that you face. You just got a lot going on.
Boy, do we ever.
In addition to this, I'm not against us, being assigned the task by the city council. I would hope you guys would, at your next meeting or at your meeting of the whole, would make some specific recommendations or tasks for the FAC to take on. And if it's to continue on the work, I think we can maybe get 1 or 2 meetings in, but I don't know that you're going to get much more than that. And the material has to be prepared, to drive a meeting of some worth.
Yeah.
The other thing I asked for some specifics, or made some specific recommendations about things we haven't even talked about, which is the airport fund and the water fund, both of which have serious issues in my mind that we haven't even discussed that need to be adjusted. If I were on the city council, I would not pass a budget based on what's in front of me without recognizing those 2 major areas that are outside of the general fund discussion. So there's things to be discussed over and above just these cuts. Again, I'm not against meeting as long as we can be prepared, but I don't see much more than 1 or 2, and I don't know if you're going to get a specific answer even at that. I still think having budget amendments, opening it up, doing the freeze, and tasking us with continuing the work would make some sense.
And would that would bring us to half on the hiring freeze, as you said, right?
Well, and I use that as an example, yes.
Yeah.
That's 800,000 of the, well, it's not quite half, but it's almost.
Big chunk. Yeah, but
yeah, right.
One of the things that you have to be very careful about, that looks easy, But you have to look at what the components of that 800,000 are.
Absolutely.
And there may be some positions there that are vacant that you want to fill. And some of them, one, we've discussed, but it includes, for example, the Human Resources Director. Okay, that's part of the 800,000. I'm not making a case one way or the other. There are also going to be some positions in there that potentially come open due to retirements in January, that if you don't fill those positions, that's going to be part also, and they may be just positions that the council would choose to fill.
Yeah. But the good news about that is that gives the city manager flexibility to make that restructuring and have some room to move 5 or 6 positions around if they disagree with the current allotment of positions. Sure. So that's not a bad thing.
They could come and make their case.
Not only that.
What's that, Bob?
They could come make their case to the council for approval.
Right. And not only that, but we don't want to tie the new city manager's hands. And actually, you're talking about walking in and filling up, putting in what they want to put in. And then under our direction, what we're looking for on that hiring process, we're in a bad situation, but we can make a good situation out of it.
Dave mentioned that it was maybe 7 to 14 days now that this guy has taken on a number of other responsibilities and has done a very, very admirable job. I've tried to work with him each and every day. My question to you, Ray, is given the consensus that we may want to meet and continue the discussion a couple of times between now and the end of the year, does that allow you and staff to, do we have the time to do this? And I want you to be frank and candid with us.
Absolutely. So from a timing perspective, the first thing that we need to be cognizant of is the property tax levy. So from a statutory perspective, the property tax levy has a specific due date, and this year, I believe it's December 26th. So in order to get that passed through, we're scheduled to actually have public hearing and first reading of the property tax levy this coming Monday.
On Monday.
Followed by passage on December 10th. So that issue in and of itself is a little bit more timely. So my hope was to get some firm direction on that part of it tonight. As far as the budget's concerned, we were targeting first reading of the budget for December 10th, followed potentially by a second reading at a special meeting the week of the 17th. So between now and then, could we fit in another meeting? I think we could. In terms of the materials that we put together and presented to you, it would be substantially similar to what you have in front of you tonight, but I would refine it down to what I think you're looking for based on the conversation tonight. And some of the things that I'll make you aware of, just on the surface, put together the vacant position freeze as an option, and you look at that table. That table is simply a list of all the vacancies that are anticipated for January 1st. If you asked me today from a management perspective if I recommend freezing a police sergeant and 3 police officers, the answer is absolutely not. We talked about that when we put those forward as potential cuts. It wasn't even that deep. So there's things on that list that I can't recommend to you in good conscience, but there's other things that you need to keep in mind. So, we've talked about this kind of jokingly, but I currently fill the role of city manager, assistant city manager, HR director, management analyst. So those are all vacant positions that aren't consuming salaries right now. And even once you hire your new city manager, it's going to take time to put all those pieces back into place. So there's some budgetary savings in that, in the time that it's going to take to rebuild your structure in the city manager's office alone.
Right.
So those are things that we need to understand moving forward. While there's things on this vacant position list that I would not support and not recommend that you consider in terms of the number of police officers specifically, there are other things that we can pull more definitive numbers on to give you as options in that regard.
I think Mr. Tarazinski brought that up when he first brought up the hiring freeze, is when you're talking about the police and fire.
Absolutely.
Okay, any other comments on the 2019 budget? Let's move to item number D, 2018 property tax levy discussion. And Ray, you wanted to speak to this item?
Thank you, Mayor. So, over the course of the past several months, both the FAC and the City Council have discussed different options for the property tax levy at a number of meetings. And initially, when we discussed this, we had reached some level of consensus that, again, this year we would target the rate and attempt to capture the EAV growth of the city. And at that time, it looked like, based on the information we had from the county, that that was going to be about 4%. And we actually looked at a model to levy at a more optimistic level to capture any potential growth that came in late above that 4%. So we had talked about that being the optimistic growth model, and we had received consensus that that would be the way we would levy this year. After we reached that consensus on that issue, it came to light that some of that EAV growth was actually a result of a 4% multiplier that is going to be applied to DeKalb Township specifically. So that raises the property values of properties in that township, which is the majority of the city of DeKalb. And that, I think, went against what the council and the FAC were really trying to do. So when we looked at what the actual growth is in terms of new construction, it's quite a bit below 4%.
0.2%.
Correct. So the new direction was to only capture that amount of growth that's a result of new construction. And we went back and adjusted the levy to that level, and that is when we essentially lost about $250,000 in property tax revenue with that most recent direction that we received. Take you back to the city council meeting recently where we adopted the tax levy ceiling. We did so at that higher rate to capture the full 4% in growth, merely as a conservative approach and to put a safety net in place. So we've set that ceiling under the Truth in Taxation Act, and we did the proper notice on that, but absolutely the council and the FAC could agree on a different direction or stick with the most recent direction, was to only capture the growth resulting from new construction. So, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the consensus we would be looking for tonight is what approach you want us to take on the levy so that we could prepare that for next Monday's meeting for the public hearing and first reading of the levy.
Mike?
I can tell you that personally, I'm not talking for the committee, I did not have that understanding of what the adopted rate would be. I believe that when there's inflation, and that is essentially what the multiplier is, you capture it. And so I think that you know, having a 4% increase in the tax bill, you know, it's the way that I explain it. I'll just use an example. I have in my consulting work over time, I've often promised people that I would pay their property taxes for any increase in value of their property. And in exchange, I want the capital gain on their house. And, you know, contrary to what many people are seeing, I'm showing right now that there's market values are down about 5%, not 15%. If they're down 5%, I'd be surprised. And they're beginning to recover. I think it's unreasonable when housing values are increasing that that people expect, with increasing bills for the city, that their property taxes stay the same even though the value of their house is going up.
Further thought? Alderman Jacobson.
Again, under the fundamental reality of fairness, when your value goes up, your taxes go up. But then when your values went down so significantly, so too should have been your tax bills.
No,
and they never
absolutely
were.
not, Dave.
Again, if your argument is that as values go up, you should tax more, because that's fair, then when your value goes down and you had negative capital gains, I'm sure you weren't willing to take those negative capital gains of 15 or 18 or 20% that many of our homeowners have absorbed in this community. So again, if your argument is that fundamentally when you make more, you should be taxed more, and I agree with that fundamental reality, when you make less, you should be taxed less. And in reality, in our community, we continued to push the millage, so not only do they pay less when their values were down, they paid more.
Actually, we're both right, okay? And you should never be looking at the millage, okay? You should never be looking at the millage. This should be an issue of looking at what is necessary for the levy in terms of dollars of levy, okay? And in theory, as property values go up, your millage rate should go down, in theory, okay? And I'm not gonna argue because it's to be perfectly honest with you, for the city's bill, it's a pittance. You know, the difference between doing what I'm suggesting and what the council has chosen to do, it's a pittance. You know, I'm making a theoretical point that I would not go to the mat for. You know, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, given all the discussion that has been had about the property tax levy, and given that you have a public hearing next week with an intervening holiday, I don't want to mess with changing or suggesting changing what you've already done. I mean, I think we need to go forward with that, and reasonable people can disagree.
Mike?
On a go-forward basis, though, certainly I can see capturing the new growth, but to have a more favorable view by Moody's, shouldn't we consider some type of a percentage increase to capture those resources, maybe aligned with CPI, some type of a, maybe not the full 4% that we're talking about, but at least show some type of progress to Chair Petal's point, to honoring those past obligations.
Have we had that, did we have that discussion last council meeting?
No.
What would you propose? Or are you prepared to come back Monday night as part and parcel of the discussion after the public hearing and come up with a number?
I would entertain that discussion, whether it just should be CPI. Chair Petal, what are your thoughts?
Well, actually, I think that the issue is a much larger one than what you're talking about. And let's just talk about a theoretical discussion with respect to only the bond rating. Okay, and I realize that you can't do that. It's a political question, and it's a question where you have to face the voters, you have to face your neighbors. But the bottom line is what you could do best with respect to Moody's alone, okay, or the bond rating agency, is increase the proportion of the pension payments, including IMRF and Social Security, increase the proportion that's being covered by the property tax, because that's increasing the proportion that is something that's under the city's control, and that would be the most aggressive stance. Beyond that, I think it's a matter of what you're comfortable with.
Would we have that number? The number that Mike just alluded to?
Yeah,
we know that.
You fund 100%,
fund 100% of your responsibility.
Of all of the pensions with the property tax.
Which would result in about a 40% increase on today's dollars.
It could be substantial.
With 10% annual increases, well above CPI.
It would be substantial. Yes, it would be.
Yeah, Tom.
I'm not advocating.
I'm sorry I got to go back all through this again. Look at your property tax budget. What does the 5-year extension show you? What's it telling us? How much is the property tax going up in the next 5 years?
So if you look at the 5-year financial forecast as it's prepared today, the FY19 projection is just over 6 million.
And in 23?
Projected out to 23,
Nine.
it's 9.6.
So how much is it up? 50%. That's going to cover more than
Those are scheduled increases that are being put into those assumptions.
No, they're not.
No, they aren't. No, they're not.
They better not be.
I'm pretty sure that's how it was presented to us the first time.
Well, let them answer the question.
All right.
So my understanding is there is a portion of that that's TIF related. It's the TIFs coming offline and you realizing the full property tax
Exactly.
of that.
So if I'm in front of a bound council, I'm going to take this document, I'm going to take my TIF budget, and I'm going to show them exactly how we're covering our responsibilities. You're going to have a 50% increase in property tax revenues just because TIF comes off. That solves this equation, doesn't it?
I think there's another component in there, and I did not work on this, so I can't speak to the exact numbers, but I'm fairly certain there is some other growth built into that increase for economic development.
If that growth is in there above a CPI number, then I would want it backed off, and that would be another good exercise for the FAC to take up in our budget discussions, because this discussion has been had 4 years in a row, and we are covering our liabilities with reliable tax revenues such as pilot, such as the cost recovery from our fire department and others. So the need to increase property tax to cover additional pension liabilities, I disagree with. Now, if you want to have a general revenue increase and say we need 2% to cover your wage growth, which is in your, in your contracts, Sycamore just did this. They adopted a 2% CPI basic increase, which is somewhat logical to me. But to David's point earlier, if you go back over the last 5 years, your property tax increases are substantial because the council passed substantial property tax increases. In 1 year, under the prior city manager, you adopted a 23% increase in the city tax. So there have been substantial tax increases that you have adopted and that's how your tax revenue, just going across the schedule, has gone up as much as it has in an attempt to help address the pension. But that's why I threw pilot out there. I'd throw our agreement with our fire recovery, which is labor, which includes all costs, total cost recovery, that those are things that do help pay for those pensions. So I disagree with the argument that our property taxes are not covering it, and on a go-forward basis, they're going to be very close to covering it.
Alderman Fanouken.
Two questions I make. In the 5-year projection.
Speaking to the mic.
I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, better turn it on too. In the 5-year projection, does that include the assumption that TIF 3 occurs or not occurs? That's one question that you probably can't answer off the top of your head. But then the other question would be, there was some online conversation about that maybe an error was occurred in the printing of our truth in taxation document in the paper. A typo, yeah.
You want Jason to answer that?
Yeah, so if I could ask Jason Michnick to speak to the TIF portion of that.
At this point, the assumption that TIF 3 moves forward is not built into that. If council was to approve TIF 3, depending on the timing of that, it's approximately 5.3 in incremental EAV that would go back onto the tax rolls if it was approved this year. It's something that we could levy for in FY19. Depending on the timing, if that gets pushed out past the official assessments, then it would be the following year. And then the TIF 2 ending December 31st, that doesn't hit the tax rolls until FY22. And then TIF 1 wouldn't hit until FY23.
And what are those numbers again, real quickly, Jason, please?
For
additional EAV.
For TIF 3, it would be 5.3 million.
That would come on or come off?
Go on to the tax rolls. So there's a 5.3 incremental from what you're pulling out of TIF 2 and TIF 1. It's 5.3 million in incremental value that would go back onto the tax rolls when you create TIF 3 and reset the base value of those parcels.
That's just TIF 2.
No, that's the value of what would go back onto the tax rolls with the creation of TIF 3.
So that's and closing out TIF 2.
No, TIF 2 is about 12 million.
Or TIF 1.
TIF 1 is about 55 million.
That will come back on?
Yes.
In 2022?
It would, yes, it would be tax year 2022. So FY23 is when the city would be able to capture that in its levy.
And when we close TIF 2, what does that result in coming back on?
A little under 12 million.
12 million.
Mike?
Two observations. Number one, we're kicking the revenue down the road. I don't like that either. You know, we're saying, okay, well, we don't have to do anything now because it's going to get better in 2022 or 23 with all of this new EAV coming on. I think that's a mistake. Second of all, while technically true, we're speculating with respect to Moody's accepting any of the things that the FAC recommended. The only thing that is certain, okay, and this is not a scare scenario, it's factual. The only thing that is certain is if you collect it directly from your tax levy, that will count with Moody's. There's a reasonable expectation that the payments in lieu of taxes would also count for Moody's. There's some question, and there was a discussion that Moody's would not count the NIU contract. So, you know, it's a little bit like asking an attorney whether what you're doing is legal. And this happened in another community, and oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I said, wait a minute, are you saying that there's a statute or something that you know, case law that supports this, or are you saying, gee, if we get sued, I think I can go to court and win? And it was the latter. It was the latter. And so, to some extent, we're playing that game with Moody's too, and it may very well work out.
Does that give us clear indication now what we need to do on Monday night? In terms of setting this tax levy? Ray, are you clear?
So what I'm hearing is you want to stay with the last direction you provided of capturing the new growth only.
Right, the 0.2%.
Yeah.
Yeah, David.
Again, looking at those numbers, Tom, I can tell you, next year you're showing a 10% increase with a 2% of it being accounted for by that TIF coming offline. So they're showing 8.5% annual increases to balance those numbers for the next 4 years, and they're phantom. They don't exist.
Gotta go through the forecast. Because if you got $80 million in TIF increment between the two at a 1.2% rate, it's collectively $900,000.
Over the course. But again, a 12 million results in a 2% EAV increase, which would be a 2% tax increase in base. And they're showing over a 10 next year. So there's additional assumptions made of significant increases that have been tracked since last time when we did this, and they were showing smaller increases, but when we've pushed them off and not doing incremental raises, they've just been backloading those back to the back of the 5-year projection.
Alderman Fanouken.
Yeah, Ray, if I could ask, though, following up, you know, the mayor just answered that we were looking to stay at that 2%, but I think you should bring in that number that would give us not just the new construction, but give us the option again of that all of that increase assessed, the 4% across the board. Show us what that number is at least. I think that's important for us to have too, as for Monday night.
We can do that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Would that be that top number that we needed the black box add-on?
It would not. So the black box add-on was done at what we believed would be the highest possible rate,
which was
6.5, which was the 6, that optimistic
okay.
growth. But if we back that down just to the straight 4% growth, we would show you what that looks
Yeah,
like.
I think that's important that we have that at least as a point of information, so we continue to have a good conversation on where we truly need to go. And I think that's what Alderman Verbeek was indicating earlier.
Precisely.
So,
That number might then go
Whatever
right back to where you were talking about. Yeah.
I have a piece of information. I just went into the CAFRs. Okay, this is from 2008 to fiscal year 2017. Okay, the required pension contribution in 2008, which included IMRF, was approximately $3 million. The required pension contribution in 2017, this is the required pension contribution, was $11 million. Okay? So don't talk about this increase in the levy alone. The bottom line is your budget is got $8 million in expenditures that weren't there 8 years ago, solely attributable to the pensions.
It's our budget. We're all in this together.
Correct. Absolutely.
That could be one of the concluding statements, although I see Ron had his hand up.
I was scratching my head.
Okay, let me then, I think we're pretty well, we have consensus on what council needs to do Monday night following the public hearing on the 2018 property tax levy discussion. What I hear, and let me summarize this in 1 minute or less, that we want to move forward with the possibility of scheduling at least 2 more meetings with the Finance Advisory and the Council, that we need to be very cognizant of the fact that we are going to have a new city manager, and that city manager ought to have the ability to do some amendments to the budget that we could use going forward, keeping in mind that at this point we probably will be dipping into that those reserve funds. Is that a clear is that what we did tonight?
Wasn't there
Okay.
something in there about a freeze?
I beg your pardon?
Wasn't there something in there about a freeze? We were going
Yeah, I think we could very easily take a look at that, yes, Yeah, I think that's a component piece. I don't think it's going to be something that we're going to decide Monday night. I think we want to continue to massage that, if you will, going forward in our subsequent discussions. Okay, any other information for the good of the cause? Ray, you've got your work cut out for you, as if you had nothing to do. What you and I need to do tomorrow, perhaps, is just take a look at the calendar and try to get something set up for at least 1 or 2 joint meetings, keeping in mind that we're just not going to probably have as great a turnout as we have tonight, but perhaps we will, who knows?
We need a quorum of both bodies.
Yes, right, we do need a quorum of both bodies. That was my point earlier. Tom?
One last time, on the glass half full, look, you have a balanced budget in front of you if you adopt all the $1.6 million adjustments and cuts. So that's a positive. And if you're going to write a headline, I think that's a much better one.
Okay.
Well, where's this $1.8 million?
You are not dipping into fund balance based on next year's operating. It's fund balance shortfall.
Right, but you have to dip into the fund balance for $1.8 million.
Not according to the spreadsheets. It's this year's budget that we're $1.8 million short in.
It's this year.
It's 2018 that we're short in.
Okay. But the fund balances will be 1.8 million less.
Yes, they will, but at least you have an operating budget that's balanced, and if you hold on the freeze, you would actually run a surplus, and if you moderate that freeze with other open positions and you substitute some others, you still could be well on your way to getting close to that 800 grand. On the positive note.
Okay, I like your glass half full. Any further comments? I'd entertain a motion to adjourn this special joint meeting.
So moved.
Second.
Been moved by Finance Advisory Committee Neely and seconded by City Council meeting Verbeek. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned. Thank you very, very much.